Since being released, Sylas has been one of the most popular mid lane champions in the game. It's not hard to understand why either. He's a ton of fun with a lot of mobility, damage, carry potential, and some super high skill expression by having access to every ultimate in the game. Sadly, this is precisely what keeps so many players away from picking him. With such a high difficulty curve, how could you ever hope to master him? Don't worry, because Sylas is actually a lot easier to play than you might think. With a bit of knowledge, his kit is really easy to pilot, and even you can start instantly dominating games on him. So in this guide, we'll break down everything you need to know to get started. We'll cover his 2 distinct build paths, some laning tips, how to team fight, we'll then break down his ultimate and how it works, and wrap things up with every last tip and trick you need to know. Before we get into it though, if you truly want to improve fast and get the rank you've always wanted, then head to skillcap.com. We take the highest priority skills you need to learn to climb ranks fast, such as wave control, and then break it down into a step-by-step course of bite-sized 1 to 2 minute videos that are easy to understand. So while you wait for your next game to start, you can learn freezing, fast pushing, slow pushing, bouncing waves, the list goes on, all in just a few minutes to maximize your improvement rate. Every week, we add a brand new exclusive course. This week, we actually created a Master in Minutes on Sylas, which perfectly pairs with the guide you're about to watch. These courses have been getting 5-star ratings from all of our users, raving at how helpful they are. That's not all though, as every week we release 10 brand new Smurf commentaries where a challenger player teaches you how to climb out of the exact rank you're stuck in. If you're looking for something more personal instead, then we got you covered with one-on-one coaching from our trained challenger experts. All this seemed too good to be true? Well, don't worry, we're backed by a rank up guarantee. If you don't significantly improve while actively using SkillCapped, then you get your money back, no questions asked. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below and get the rank you've always wanted. Alright, now let's get into the guide. As we mentioned, Sylas has quite a few different build paths he can go in regards to items, runes, and even his skill ordering. For the sake of simplicity, we'll break it down into 2 simple builds you can run. In this section, we'll cover the strengths of both builds and when to run one choice over the other. The first variation is probably the one that most players are familiar with when it comes to Sylas. You'll be maxing W while running a Conqueror rune page. The strength of this setup is you're very high in combat sustain. Maxing W reduces the cooldown significantly while increasing the healing as well. Pair that up with Conqueror and you can spam tons of powerful heals in the middle of a fight, making it difficult to take you down. This build is perfect when there are a ton of beefier targets on the enemy team. Fights are likely to run longer in this case, which means that you'll be getting way more value out of this combat healing build. As for your items, you'll generally rush Rod of Ages into some Bruiser AP items, which you can round out with the standard late game mage items such as Void and Deathcap. As for your second build option, this is closer to an assassin playstyle. You'll be running a First Strike rune page, while maxing Q instead of W, which you'll max last. Since the W max build is usually the standard on Sylas, most players aren't actually aware of how overpowered his Q technically is. If you land both parts of it, the ability has a 130% AP ratio with a ton of base damage. It's an insane ability if you land it. This is why this build is heavily reliant on the item Everfrost. When maxing Q, this will be your bread and butter combo for scoring kills. E forward, root your opponent with Everfrost, Q them, then land your E2, which will keep them locked up for your Q's explosion damage to land. Do this properly and you will delete people. Keep in mind that if you decide to go this route, that you'll be significantly less tanky in longer encounters. Without maxing W, your in-combat sustain is basically non-existent. You won't be playing like the regular version of Sylas, and instead you should try to weave in and out of fights as much as possible, much like an assassin would. So we'd only recommend running this version when the enemy composition leans on the squishier side, where you have ample targets to one-shot. A final benefit of this build is that all your damage is basically instant burst. This is why you're running First Strike for your runes. Every combo you pull off properly will give you a ton of gold, which can let you snowball out of control once you get going. And to round out your items, you'll want to go Sork Boots, Shadow Flame, and then standard AP items based on what you might need. Now, although those 2 builds share slightly different playstyles, the rest of what we cover in this guide will apply to both variations of Sylas. So let's get started with the laning phase. Unfortunately, like many other scaling champions, Sylas has laning phase issues that you'll have to deal with. He tends to have mana problems early on top of very high cooldown abilities, which means that you are incredibly weak during the early levels of the lane. During levels 1 to 5, we recommend just taking it slow most of the time and trying to farm up. Don't worry, you'll be strong quite soon. Because of this though, you will have to be comfortable last hitting under tower. Thankfully, Sylas is pretty decent at that, as long as you understand something about his passive. When using a spell, your next auto will be enhanced, dealing extra damage to your main target, and a little bit of splash to everything around you as well. What's nice about this is that when you see a full HP caster minion tank a turret shot, you can use a passive proc to last hit. At the same time, the little bit of splash damage around you perfectly sets up the caster minions to take a turret shot and then be low enough to be auto-attacked. Thanks to that, even in terrible matchups, you should be able to maintain your farm decently enough. Of course, being weak early on doesn't mean you can't ever trade. Depending on how the matchup is, or if your opponent makes a mistake, Sylas can definitely punish. That being said, you want to get in, use all 3 of your abilities, get some passive autos off, and instantly get out. You don't ever want to extend a trade too much as Sylas early on, because you are completely out of damage for a long time due to your high cooldowns. Okay, so you're playing to survive early, but what are your main goals for winning lane? The first is just gank setups. If you're constantly being shoved in, then you should be able to kill the enemy mid laner with your jungler. Sylas has some of the best gank setup in the game with his E forward into his E2. So even though you're weak, your opponent often has to be careful even if they spam shove you in. Obviously, you won't always get jungle help. As for winning 1v1, here's the spikes that you want to look out for with the 2 build variations we talked about. For Conqueror WMax Sylas, you start being able to play very aggressively at levels 7 and 9. This is when you've got quite a few points in W, making the cooldown go down significantly. Being able to use your W way more often gives you a ton of sustain in the lane as well as a lot of guaranteed damage with an ability you can't miss. Every odd level where you put another point in W is definitely a big spike for Sylas. For the Qmax version, your wave clear becomes decent at around level 7. You can push waves to put pressure, roam, base, etc. But your real spike with Qmax comes once you have Everfrost, as we've already talked about. Then you can really start dominating the lane with your all-in combo. Moving past the laning phase, we get into the mid game where you'll start skirmishing and team fighting a whole lot more. Now, we have to say, the real reason you pick Sylas is for his mid-game skirmishing. He is insane in those 2v2 or 3v3 battles you'll often find in solo queue. He's so versatile because he can choose what ultimate he can take, plus all the mobility, sustain, and damage makes him a super deadly champion in these smaller scale fights. This is why you'll love to be in a side lane or lurking in the jungle. Sylas is so tricky to take down and has so many different ways of approaching fights that he'll almost always have the upper hand. So not only can you win fights, but just wasting your opponent's time is usually a massive win as well. And this point will bring us to team fighting. The immediate mistake that many new players make on Sylas is playing him like a bruiser in fights. So, do you guys know how there is always this massive clump of melees in a fight? All the tanks and bruisers are whacking each other while the ranged characters try to hit them, right? Do not be in that clump as Sylas. This is a perfect example of what we mean. A fight is brewing near Dragon, and at the start, Sylas will just stick right next to all his other frontliners and be part of the brawl. Look, your sustain is good, but a single 300 heal every 4 seconds or so is not going to save you from being focused by 3 or 4 people. So what should you be doing then? It's a little tough, but in big scale fights, you will generally be looking for those fights on the outskirts of the engagement. It's still a part of the team fight, but it's a bit more isolated and feels closer to a skirmish. As we discussed, that's what precisely you excel in as Sylas, so this is where you'll naturally thrive in team fights. This will be a pretty good example of how a standard Sylas fight may look. Notice how when this engagement breaks out, Sylas isn't fully committing to the brawl. Instead, he just hits whoever is the front line a bit, and then patiently kites back a bit every now and then. But when the fight scatters, he can fully commit to an isolated target and easily destroy them in the 1v1. This all being said, everything can change based on what ultimates you have available to you. That's the general guideline as Sylas, but he's so versatile in the way that he can approach every game that it's impossible to tell you exactly what you should be doing in every fight. Sometimes you can be in that massive clump if you have access to something like a Swain, a Mumu, or Alistar ultimate that lets you tank multiple people. Or you could play closer to an assassin if you have an evasion based on ultimate to get in and get out after. This is honestly one of the few hard parts about Sylas that is hard to say much about. You usually just have to adapt to teamfights based on the ultimate you have, and that just takes time to learn. But that's probably the most fun part about learning Sylas. Seeing what you can and can't get away with will change every game and make every match feel really exciting. Which means we should probably break that down now. This overwhelming feeling of having to know how every ultimate in the game works is often the reason people are so put off from playing Sylas. Trust us when we say it's honestly not that hard to know what ultimate you should take and how to use it. The first thing to keep in mind is that your immediate instinct for what ultimate to take is almost always going to be correct. So looking at this team composition, which ultimate would you instinctively think about stealing? Most of you probably immediately thought to take Rumble's R. The others are fine, but a massive AoE damage ultimate is too good to pass up, right? It's honestly that easy. If an ultimate sounds strong, it probably will be strong when you take it. Now, the reason for that is because of how his ult scales. So listen up, because there's actually some very powerful ultimates you should be on the lookout for. If Sylas steals the ult of an attack damage champion, he will convert their AD ratios into AP ratios. All this means is that you should never be afraid to take something like a Riven ult because you think it'll deal no damage. It definitely will. Now for AP ults, Sylas actually keeps the original ratio. This is very important because there are a lot of champions, particularly those that came out in older seasons, that randomly have ridiculous AP ratios on their ultimates. They're balanced because those champions never build AP, but luckily Sylas can really abuse this to his advantage. The best part is that a lot of the ultimates from this list are AoE crowd control ultimates that deal a ton of damage on top of that. They are among some of the strongest ults you can take, so always be on the lookout for them. Alright, with all that covered, let's round this guide out with some tips to help you maximize Sylas' potential every game. So to begin with, Sylas' basic abilities aren't really that complicated to use, and he's actually a very simple champion to pick up outside of his ultimate. To be honest, you can just press all your buttons on your opponent, auto-attack them to proc your passive procs, and you'll do fine in a lot of fights. There are a few things you can do to get a bit more value out of your abilities or make them slightly more consistent though, so let's start there. Your E2 is a pretty powerful spell to land, but can sometimes easily be dodged. To make it easier to land, you often want to E1 towards your opponent, then close the gap even further with your W. Once you're on top of them, it's pretty hard to miss your E2, so this should make it way easier to land in most cases. Something else you can do, specifically during the lane phase, is to abuse your opponent's feeling of safety. Hiding behind minions is the most common way of denying Sylas' E, but you have so many AoE tools with your Q, passive, and even Everfrost that you can often kill the minions guarding your opponent to make a path to land your E. This is honestly a very consistent way of catching your opponents off guard to score some nice harass or kills. Another key thing about your E is that you can cast your W while you're chaining to your target. This is good for a couple of reasons. One, it lets you burst really quickly. So if you land E2 on a target, you can spam your W as you're flying towards them for instant burst and healing the second you arrive. If you noticed in our previous email, it can also be used to cancel your own pull. One issue that Sylas has versus good players is that he travels in a straight line towards them, making it easy to counter his engage. So versus good players, you can often land E2, bait them to waste their ability, and cancel your pull by Wing to a nearby other target. This is rather rare and only relevant in higher elos, but we felt that we should include it. Another way to counterplay your E's own weakness is with Zhonya's. You can pull yourself to a target and go into stasis so you can't be countered. Now, while those are rather niche E tips, this is one you'll use every single game. You should know that the cooldown of your E begins ticking down not after you chain someone, but after the initial dash. So what a lot of good Sylas players do is prep their E before going in. Notice how Sylas uses his E but doesn't immediately commit. He waits until it's about to run out before trying to land it. He misses, but because it has such a short cooldown now, he can catch the enemy Jhin off guard with another attempt. Thanks to that, he manages to score a bunch of kills. This is a great way for maximizing mobility, damage, and CC in fights, so make sure you do it whenever possible. The final tip to keep in mind with your E is its insane map mobility. You often want to think about places where you can double jump walls with a jungle camp to use your E2 on. So for example, from the Dragon Pit to the red buff. This level of mobility is something most champions don't have access to and makes fighting Sylas in the jungle very tricky. As for your W, there's one important thing to remember. The heal actually scales based off your missing health. It maxes out when you're below 40% HP. This is especially relevant for the W max Conqueror builds. You shouldn't be too afraid of dipping low in HP since you have access to some big burst healing whenever you're nearly dead. Now for our final tip, remember that Sylas is a scaling champion and you become a monster at level 16 because of how low your ult's cooldown gets. You can steal an ultimate every 20 seconds now, so just be aware that you can steal an ult for some quick utility and still have access to another one pretty soon. For example, Sylas' team is getting sieged right now, so he steals the Lux ultimate to clear the wave. Then a fight quickly breaks out, but Sylas' ultimate is already almost back up, so he can steal Braum's R to use later on in the fight. Having access to 2 or even 3 ultimates per late game fight is pretty OP, so make sure you abuse it when you hit 16. And if you found this guide useful, then you'll absolutely love our hyper improvement platform at skillcap.com. We take the highest priority skills you need to learn to climb ranks fast, such as wave control, and then break it down into a step-by-step course of bite-sized 1 to 2 minute videos that are easy to understand. So while you wait for your next game to start, you can learn freezing, fast pushing, slow pushing, bouncing waves, the list goes on, all in just a few minutes to maximize your improvement rate. Every week we add a brand new exclusive course. This week we actually created a Master of Minutes on Sylas, which perfectly pairs the guide you just watched. These courses have been getting 5-star ratings from all of our users, raving at how helpful they are. And that's not all though, as every week we release 10 brand new Smurf commentaries where a challenger player teaches you how to climb out of the exact rank you're stuck in. If you're looking for something more personal instead, then we got you covered with one-on-one coaching from our trained challenger experts. All this seemed too good to be true? Well, don't worry, we're backed by a rank up guarantee. If you don't significantly improve while actively using skill caps, then you get your money back, no questions asked. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below and get the rank you've always wanted. We here at Skill Capped want to thank you for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.